So, how does a small island nation end up ruling a quarter of the entire world's population? It's a huge question. Today, we're digging into the British Empire, the largest in history. We're going to unpack the ambitions, the methods, and, yeah, the very complex legacy of an empire so big the sun literally never set on it. Let's dive in.
Just look at this map. At its absolute peak, the British Empire was bigger than anything the world had ever seen before. It spanned every single continent. You've probably heard that famous phrase, the empire on which the sun never set. And it was true, because somewhere at any given moment, the sun was shining on a piece of its territory.
To put a number on that, at one point, Britain ruled over 2/5 of the entire world's land surface. That scale is just mind-boggling. And it immediately makes you wonder, how on earth did a relatively tiny island pull that off? Okay, so here's our roadmap to answer that. We'll look at the sheer scale of the empire, then quickly define our terms. After that, we'll get into the motivations, the why, before breaking down the methods they used to build it. And finally, we'll touch on its very complicated legacy.
Right, first things first. Before we can talk about how an empire is built, we need to make sure we're all on the same page with the lingo.
So what is an empire really? Well, in simple terms, it's just a group of colonies that are all ruled by a single, more powerful country. And those individual pieces, the colonies, those are the countries being ruled by that outside power. They're the building blocks of the empire. And the action, the verb that makes it all happen, is to colonize. That's the act of going into a place and establishing one of those colonies. All right, so now that we've got the what's sorted, let's get to the much more interesting question, the why. What was the point? What drove Britain to expand so aggressively all over the planet?
You know, it really boils down to four main drivers. You've got the desire to buy new things, the need for raw materials, the search for new people to sell things to, and of course, the simple pursuit of power. Let's break each one down.
First up, trade, which really means money. British merchants could sail to far-off places, buy exciting goods like silks and spices you just couldn't get back home, and then sell them in Britain for a huge profit. It was an incredibly lucrative business.
Second, raw materials. You have to remember, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing back in Britain. Its factories were like hungry beasts, and they needed to be fed. They were desperate for stuff like cotton to make clothes, and the colonies were the perfect place to get it cheap.
And third, here's the other side of that industrial coin. Once you've used all that cotton to make mountains of fabric, what do you do with it? You need someone to sell it to. The colonies were a perfect solution, a huge captive market of new customers for British-made goods.
And finally, the fourth reason, pure, simple power. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, having a massive empire was the ultimate status symbol. It was like a giant game of chess between nations. Britain grabbed land not just for its resources, but to stop rivals like France from getting it first. The more of the map you controlled, the more powerful you were.
So, we've got the motivation, they had the why, but what about the how? How did they actually do it? What were the real-world methods used to take control of almost half the planet?
Well, there wasn't one single playbook. It happened in a few key ways, depending on the time and the place. We're talking about settlement, war, so-called discovery, and trade. So on one hand, you had settlers. These were just ordinary people who left Britain to start a new life somewhere else, like the early colonists in America looking for religious freedom. Then on the other hand, you had official discovery, where explorers like Captain James Cook would plant a flag on land like Australia and claim it for Britain, totally ignoring the fact that people already lived there. And then, of course, you had the more direct methods. There's straight-up war. Britain fought its rivals, like France, and took their colonies by force. That's how they got places like Canada. But sometimes, the takeover was a bit more subtle. It would start with a trading company setting up shop, getting more and more powerful, until eventually the British government just stepped in and took over completely. This painting is a fantastic example of that takeover by trade method. What you're seeing is an employee of the East India Company. This was a private company, not the government, but it became so powerful in India that it basically ran the place. This corporate influence is what paved the way for the British government to eventually come in and take direct control. Now, building something on this insane scale is obviously going to leave a mark, a deep, deep mark. And it is so important to understand that the legacy of the empire is viewed in completely different ways depending on who you are and where you're from. There are two very conflicting stories about whether the empire was a force for good or a force for bad in the world. So let's just quickly look at the arguments on both sides.
So from one point of view, the empire was a massive success story for Britain. It made the country incredibly rich and powerful. And this perspective also argues that it spread some positive things around the world, like new technologies, think railways, and certain ideas, like democracy.
But the other perspective is that for the actual people living in those colonized countries, the whole experience was deeply negative. This view points out that their lands were exploited, their resources were taken and shipped back to Britain, and that often it left them poorer than they were before.
And this image really drives home the devastating reality of that negative side. We have to be clear about this. The economic engine of the empire, especially in the early days, was directly tied to absolutely brutal practices like the transatlantic slave trade. The human cost was catastrophic and unimaginable.
So we've walked through the why and the how of the biggest empire in history. But this isn't all just stuff in a textbook. It leaves us with a really important question for today. What is the lasting impact of that history on our modern world? On the languages we speak, the borders on our maps, and the societies we all live in right now?